afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. This is Eric Miscoll with EMSNOW. I am glad today to meet again virtually with a gentleman with in4ma who you all know or should know. in4ma is the European market research company for the EMS industry. I think they do some of the best damn work in the industry on EMS, the level of insight and the data that they do. It's all data driven. So this is good, it's timely. My colleague, Dieter Weiss, is joining us from Bavaria, right?
Exactly. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Wherever you might be.
Yeah.
Now, Dieter, I invited Dieter so that we could talk about kind of what's going on in Europe. I'm also aware of the fact that in 2 more weeks, Dieter will be joining me on the Eric Miscoll show as a guest, along with Manfred Amberger from Zollner,
Yes.
the largest EMS in Europe. So we're going to be careful not so that Dieter doesn't sound like he's repeating himself in 2 weeks. So, but who knows? The story may change by then, right, Dieter? So
Who knows?
yeah. So listen, let's start with just maybe an update on Europe, not the industry, but just with Corona and everything going on, the pandemic. How are things today in Europe?
Well, first of all, a lot of travel bans have been lifted in Europe. Spain is back to normal. People are working again. They feel very relieved about the situation. France as well. In the UK, the situation is that you still cannot enter or leave the country without going into quarantine, which is a pity. In Germany, Austria, Spain, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, travel is back to normal. In Italy as well, the borders are literally open in most of the Eastern European countries, but not to all of the European countries. For example, if you want to go to certain Eastern states and you happen to have a Swedish passport and you come from Sweden, you will have problems to get in, and the same, by the way, goes for the UK, as the coronavirus has been hitting these countries more severe. There was a lot of discussion about Sweden not doing any shutdowns. They kept everything open, everything running, and in other countries, this rose the question, why can they and why can't we as well? See, we have this situation that people have difficulties to understand the measures that the politicians have taken to fight the coronavirus. If they have the situation that within their family, they have somebody who was infected by the virus or even died, or not in the family, but in the close neighborhood, then these people realize the situation and understand the measures taken better than people who know nobody who was infected and who think that the governments are just going overboard with the preventive hygiene regulations, and they would like to make parties, specifically the younger people. Yeah, and see, depending on their personal living situation, if they are living in a big apartment building without a balcony, without anything, and being in lockdown, they have no possibility to do anything. And the lockdown over here was for nearly 3 months, and it hurt a lot. And those people have a difficulty understanding. I just came back from an eastern state over the weekend. It was my first flight after nearly 4 months now. And I was a little bit afraid as well. I thought, well, with all this situation on the plane, you have to wear a mask and you sit 1.5 meters apart. But then I entered an Airbus A320, which has 180 seats, and it was fully occupied. So I asked the stewardess, what's going on over here? At the gates, you told us we had to keep our masks on and 1.5 meters distance. And now in the plane, the distance regulation vanished, and we are sitting here with 0.5 meter distance. How can that be? The stewardess did not know any question, how to respond at all, and finally they placed me into another row where the middle seat was empty, and then the captain came to me to explain to me that the air in the plane had a laminar flow without turbulences, and was exchanged, the whole cabin air was exchanged within 2.5 minutes, and thus there was a much lower problem than at the airport in the gate. Now, I'm not an expert. I have to, first of all, accept what the captain tells me, and I hope at least he's not that stupid to work in an environment that has a high risks for himself. But I have to admit, after this experience, I promised myself for the next times until the problem with the coronavirus is over, I will only fly business class. I will not fly economy anymore. And in the States themselves where I flew to, nobody was wearing a mask. The pubs were all crowded, people were shaking hands, people were hugging and kissing, and I thought, have they not heard anything about the virus so far? It was a strange situation.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because even here in the U.S., right, it's, as you indicated before, you know, it's the younger people, right? And everybody thinks, well, you know, we have these freedoms and you're impinging on our freedoms, and we have the right to do, you know, I guess the right to be stupid if we want to be. But, you know, I often think that, you know, especially here, and I think probably democracies as a whole, you know, freedom is always balanced with responsibility, right? The freedom works to the degree that its citizens are responsible. But most people tend to ignore the responsibility part and just want to stick to the freedom piece, right? I can do whatever I want. And yeah, we're heading into 4th of July weekend here in the United States. So it'll be curious to see how this plays out. Hey, let's shift over to the industry, in the EMS industry. You've been lovingly watching this and taking it for. How are things generally going in Europe for the EMS industry these days?
Well, first of all, as far as I know, there is no shutdown of factories in Europe anymore. Factories are running depending upon the workload. So it's not a subject of the coronavirus anymore, but the factor, how is the workload? We have seen specifically in the automotive industry a big setback in the order intake. If I just take Germany, for example, where in the EMS industry, about 20 to 22% of the work is going into the automotive supplies. The company working in that area had immediately, already mid of March, big problems with the workload. They applied for what we call short work. There's a certain system in Germany, you apply for short work and you get subsidies from the states for the payment of the employees. For example, they shut down 50%. Normally people would get only 50%, but the government then pays an additional 30 to 40%. So they have more or less the same money with half the work. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is quite a good system. I don't know whether that applies for all Europe. I don't think so. At least in Germany, we have this system and it works quite well. At the moment, we have about 42% in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, about 42% of the EMS company working on short-time work, as you can fill the lines. On the other hand, we have seen a pickup in the medical industry, and it wasn't just the ventilators. It was oxygenators and other medical equipment which was badly needed. But one has to be careful. Medical industry is not necessarily medical industry. Already middle of March, everybody was told, if you don't have anything related to the coronavirus, don't go to the doctors. Stay home. That can wait.
Yeah.
In the beginning, the doctors promoted this as well and said, hey, we need to focus on people who might be infected with the virus. Stay home. End of May, the doctors started complaining, we have no patients anymore. Yeah, we have insufficient income.
Yeah.
And as we have insufficient income, we're not going to buy new medical equipment. So it's a problem that arises in many industries now and affects the business. End of May, the big companies already saw a slight pickup, whereas the small EMS all of a sudden said, hey, now it's really hurting, because in the beginning, the customers of the small EMS companies, being smaller companies themselves, they waited and saw and watched what is going on in the market. They didn't stop the orders. They didn't push them backwards, nothing.
Gotcha.
So we, the smaller companies, even in March, still saw 5 to 7% more orders coming in than in the same period of last year, whereas the big companies already were hit. Now we see the scissors going open. All of a sudden, end of March and mid-June, the small EMS companies have an order intake that is 20 to 28% below the order intake of the same period last year, whereas with the bigger companies, we are now in the region of, let's say, 6 to 10% below.
Okay.
And now we see some people talking about it'll be all back to normal end of the year, and I don't believe that anything will be back to normal end of the year.
Yeah. Before we jump to the future and kind of what you think might be happening in the industry, let's kind of take, I recall that, and we spoke about this, or at least in one of your writings for us, you wrote about that you had started a survey of EMS companies within Europe.
Yeah.
And you began that a while ago specifically to kind of track what's happening and the impact the coronavirus is having.
Yes.
Tell us about that a bit, because I think that's interesting.
I did, or I'm still doing a survey every 3 weeks with a total of 27 EMS companies in different revenue groups. I separated them. I have 5 companies who do more than 50 million euros in annual revenues. I have a second group which do 20 to 50 million in revenues. I have 8 companies from them in there. Then I have a revenue group 10 to 20 million. I have 6 companies in there. And I have a group with below 10 million in revenues, and I have 8 companies in there. In total, we are talking about combined revenues of about 2 billion euros annually, with 7,500 people. And it is important to me that I keep this group together, and they answer me my questions every 3 weeks. And only by doing this, I can compare the results from one survey to the next. Otherwise, I would be comparing apple with peaches. Yeah. Doesn't make sense.
So what are you seeing in that? You've done this, what, 3, 4 times, 5 times now?
It's 5 times now.
Okay.
And there is going to be probably until end of August another three times. Okay. Yeah.
Can you characterize kind of what you're hearing from the companies, or is that what you're speaking to already?
Yeah. I'm not only speaking with those companies which I have in the survey group, but on top, what I do is I call up companies which are not part of the survey group in order to check whether the results I get from the survey are somehow the same results that other individual companies have as well. Now, when the corona problem started in March over here in Europe, the sickness rate went up tremendously. We had the situation that people who had ache in the throat, they didn't know what to do. They didn't know, do I have the virus now?
Yeah.
Yeah? Or did I just get a cold or whatsoever? So they went to their boss, and the boss said, well, I don't know, maybe you call your doctor. Now, the doctors didn't want to see those patients. Yeah, they were afraid that those patients were carrying the virus into their offices. And so they just told every person who called, well, stay home for 2 weeks. Yeah, and then we're going to see. Yeah. At the same time, schools and kindergartens were closed. People had problems if they had a family having to look after the kids now on top. There were, in some companies, there were up to 45% of the people all of a sudden missing in March. Yeah? And at that time, it was not that the order had already declined to the same amount. Yeah? So they had quite some problems. But very fast, especially on the small companies, the employees realized that this was a situation that could bring their employer in big danger, and they might lose their jobs. So it didn't take very long until the sickness rate went down, and in every survey they went down. It was down further. In the first survey we had an average sickness rate of 12.2%. In the second, it was already below 10. In the fourth survey, it was a little bit above 5. And now the fifth survey, it was at, if I get it right, at 4.9 or 4.8%. Okay. So that is pretty normal. And specifically on the small companies, we had several companies who had 0. Yeah?
Okay.
On the capacity side, due to the fact that 41% of companies are working on short-time work, they don't have the machine capacity available, as they don't have the employees. So at the moment, we are running in the average at 78% of capacity. Yeah? Okay. And that is sufficient to fulfill all the orders that we have.
Okay.
The order intake is still low, and as I said, there's a difference between the big companies and the small companies. And in the beginning, when we asked in March, there were still problems in regards to material supplies. It was difficult to get certain components, as for example, Malaysia, the Philippines, India, North Africa, and you know where all these components come from, they all were having problems. And at the same time, due to the normal flight traffic was more or less zero. There was no flights, there was only transportation flights. And what I didn't know was that even in a normal passenger plane, they have a lot of goods flying with the passengers, and not just transport flights. So this capacity missing brought quite some substantial logistical problems to get the goods to the customers on time. And we are seeing now more and more that goods are coming by train from China via Russia, and I think it just takes a week or a week and a half to get the goods to Europe, which is faster than a ship, but probably more expensive as well. Logistic cost raised, and I think they now placed $10 per order additional for logistical costs over here in Europe in order to cope with that.
Yeah, interesting. Listen, you mentioned it a few times, and I don't know that your survey covers it, but what are you hearing, if anything, from the OEM, from the customers of the EMS? What's the sentiment? What's the impact there? Do you know?
Yes. See, I have a couple of questions which I always ask as extra questions, to say so. And in the third survey and in the fourth survey, I asked people what the situation on short-time work with the customers was. And in actual fact, it turned out that the short-time work with the OEMs was at a higher degree than with the EMS, which to me indicates that we're still not at the bottom of this problem. Some people thought end of May could be the bottom. No, I think the earliest we see bottom end of August or in September, not earlier. We've seen some strange behavior as well.
What do you mean?
Well, number one is the EMS companies try to keep close contacts with their customers in order to know what's going on, when are the next orders coming, and they are on the phone with their customers all the time. Now, everybody is on, or was at least, it's now going back again, but everybody was in home office, the customers as well as the EMS. And we had this strange behavior of some customers who felt disturbed by being called up in their home office as if they were on vacation in home office. That was one strange thing. The other thing was that customers were very careful in making any statements regarding the future. It's just that we don't know. It was that nobody had a high visibility. They were all running the business on site, which is short-sighted and means you might know what you have to do within the next 3 weeks, but afterwards you don't. So that is causing quite some irritation. But the biggest irritation we saw was a letter written by a big company, by a big OEM, to their suppliers, that they wrote, we need to go through this virus problem together, and in order to do that, we demand that you immediately reduce your prices by 7%. Now, those of you who are old enough remember Manuel Ignacio Lopez. Lopez was a buyer, a Spanish buyer who started his job at Opel and later on at General Motors and then at Volkswagen. He was a nasty person, a real nasty person. He wrote letters like that as well. And that is about, I think, yeah, it must be about 30 years ago. Yeah. And he wrote to the suppliers, you either with immediate effect reduce your prices by 10%, and that goes for orders you have in your workshop already. And if you don't accept that, in 4 weeks from now, you will not be a supplier anymore. So totally strange behavior. A lot of people rejected this, yeah, and some of them were even thrown out.
Yeah.
Others tried to cope with this. And the problem was, as a result, they didn't do all the quality tests that were necessary. We saw a big deterioration of quality. It was just a stupid thing of a stupid buyer. And
yeah, but it's a great example of somebody, I'm sure he was rewarded and his bonus was set up such that...
Yeah, he showed his boss that he was able to reduce the prices and probably even got a bonus.